What's up, Duval? It's your favorite former Jag, Bucky Brooks, and this is Believe in Jaguars, podcast dedicated to all things Jaguars. And today I decided to dedicate this entire podcast just to Trevor Lawrence, the quarterback situation, and where Trevor stacks in the rest of the NFL landscape. There's been a lot of conversation about Trevor Lawrence in recent weeks because many believe that there is a contract extension on the horizon. Trevor Lawrence was the number one overall pick in the 2021 draft. He just recently had his fifth-year option picked up at $25.7 million. And so the natural course is to pick up the fifth-year option and then begin immediately to work on a contract extension that we'd anticipate would put Trevor Lawrence in the $50 million club. Since Trevor Lawrence has kind of been in the crosshairs of a lot of conversation and a lot of debate about whether he's worthy of being paid like an elite quarterback, I thought we should just kind of unpack the Trevor Lawrence experience from his time at Clemson until he got to then his time with the Jaguars and what he's done in the last couple of years under Doug Peterson. So let's kind of get into it. So Trevor Lawrence, number one overall pick, the 2021 class. Many experts on the outside felt like, look, Trevor Lawrence is the best quarterback prospect that the league has seen since Andrew Luck. And before that, many compared him even to John Elway. Coming out of Clemson, look, he was a highly decorated prospect. I personally have watched Trevor since he was in high school, working with Elite 11, watching Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields because they were always ranked 1 and 2 in high school, just kind of watching him develop and grow. He was a guy who won at a major level in high school. I think he was a 3-time state champion. He was a guy who had all of the things at a young age that you look for in the position. Look, it was height, it was arm talent, it was athleticism, it was leadership ability, it was playmaking ability. He had all those things in high school. He then goes to Clemson and he follows behind like a legend at Clemson, in Deshaun Watson. He steps in, a lot of hype, a lot of fanfare about who he was and what he would be, but he ultimately closed the deal and he led Clemson to a national title. And what you saw from Trevor Lawrence at Clemson was a guy who was mature beyond his age, a guy who kind of understood how to be the face of the franchise very, very early as he represented Clemson and kind of took them to even higher heights, and a guy who, look, lived up to the hype that preceded his arrival. This guy won at a major level, exhibited all the characteristics and qualities of being a QB1 at the highest level. And after you watched him and after you looked at his skills and you projected out what they could be at the next level, look, he was kind of a surefire, quote unquote, can't miss number one overall prospect in the class. When I go back and I personally look at my notes from when Trevor was coming out, the things that stood out to me, not only did he have like A-plus talent. When you watched him, he had the talent in terms of being able to throw the ball, throw it in tight windows, throw it down the field. Range was limitless when it came to being able to push the ball down the field. He had the athleticism where you could execute zone reads and pull the ball and be an impact as a true dual threat, even though you didn't necessarily want him to do that at the next level. He had that club in his bag. When I made the comparison when Trevor Lawrence was coming out, I actually dubbed him Justin Herbert Plus, meaning I felt like he was very similar to Justin Herbert and the Justin Herbert that I watched at Oregon lead his team to the Rose Bowl, lead his team to the Pac-12 title, a guy who came into the league and really took the league by storm immediately when he stepped in as the quarterback for the Chargers. In looking at Trevor Lawrence, I saw very, very similar qualities, but even more talent than what Justin Herbert displayed. When you looked at their size, you looked at their arm talent, you looked at their ability, it was very easy for me to see Trevor Lawrence doing a lot of the stuff that Justin Herbert has done in the league and did in the league very, very early. So then we fast forward to the draft, and the draft comes, and it's a class that was really held as maybe a golden era, potentially quarterback class. Like many thought that quarterback class in 2021 was going to revolutionize the game. We fast forward now, Trevor Lawrence is the only quarterback that is with his original team. He's the last quarterback standing. You look at Zach Wilson, Trey Lance, Justin Fields, Mac Jones, they are no longer with their original teams. And if we really talk about those other guys, I don't know if any of those other guys are really viewed as being long-term starters in this league. The only guy that I put an asterisk by would be Justin Fields, because Justin Fields has played at a level where he should be a starting quarterback in the league, and he might get that opportunity to do it in Pittsburgh. But when you look at Zach Wilson, Trey Lance, and even Mac Jones, they all are kind of slated to be backup quarterbacks, and they hope to have another opportunity. I find it interesting that Mac Jones is now backing up Trevor Lawrence, but that'll be a conversation for a later day. Well, anyway, when you look at Trevor Lawrence, and let's talk about what he's done since he jumped into the league. He jumped into the league in, 2021 was an absolute disaster. Like, Urban Meyer certainly didn't do him any favors. When you look at the way that Darrell Bevell and Brian Schottenheimer tried to build an offense around Trevor, it just didn't work for the skills that Trevor had or the offense that was coming out of in Clemson. Sometimes you have that. Sometimes you have user error. The Jaguars quickly moved on from Urban Meyer, and they bring in Doug Peterson. Well, immediately, the jump that Trevor Lawrence made from his rookie season to his sophomore season was significant. You talk about the second year as a starter, but first year in Doug Peterson's system in 2022, 66.3 completion rate, 4,100 yards, 25 touchdowns, only 8 interceptions. The passer rating was 95.2. Jaguars post a winning season, go to the playoffs and win a playoff game. Come back next year, 2023 campaign. Look, the hype is around the Jaguars. They expected to be a team that is maybe a fringe title contender. Trevor Lawrence has a year that, look, is disappointing on some level, but when you look at the stat line is almost identical to the previous year. 65.6% completion rate, 4,000 yards, 21 touchdowns. He has 14 interceptions, uptick in interceptions. Passer rating dips to 88.5. But in 2 years under Doug Peterson, the Jaguars have posted back-to-back winning seasons for the first time since the 90s, the mid-90s, late 90s, or whatever. You think about that long run, Trevor Lawrence has certainly played winning football for the Jaguars. When you look at what he's done from a stat standpoint, 46 touchdowns, 22 interceptions, that is a 2-to-1 ratio touchdown interception, which is what you want. If you get up to 2.5 to 1, man, that's really ideal. 3 to 1, you talk about super elite in terms of being able to be super productive when it comes to putting the ball in the paint while also taking care of the ball at a high level. So sheerly based on the stats, Trevor Lawrence has certainly been a little bit of what he's been exactly what the Jaguars expected. Franchise quarterback, come in, change the narrative around the franchise, put the franchise in a position to be a winning franchise, and really on the fringe of being a perennial playoff contender. If you look at last year, let's be honest, the team was 8-3. The team should have finished the right way and should have made it into the playoffs for back-to-back years, which would have been very, very successful. And this conversation probably will be a little different. But let's dig a little deeper into that season last year, because I think last year left a bit of a bad taste in everyone's mouth, which is why there's so much debate about Trevor Lawrence. Last year, when you look at the first, 10 or 11 games, Trevor Lawrence played, I would say, probably B-plus football for this team, which is certainly good enough to not only win, but good enough to have this team positioned to be the number one seed at in the AFC at the time of, I would say, that injury that we saw him suffer against the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, the guy was rolling. He had it going. He was figuring it out. This offense still wasn't clicking to expectation, but the offense was certainly moving the ball. He was adjusting and adapting to a new play caller in his ear, because remember, Press Taylor took over the play calling duties for Doug Peterson after Doug Peterson called the plays in Trevor Lawrence's first year. We think about this wide receiver core that he was playing with. We had Christian Kirk, we had Calvin Ridley, we had Zay Jones playing. Evan Ingram was obviously dominating as the tight end. Well, the difference in that receiving core and the receiving core that he had in 2022, when you had Zay Jones, Marvin Jones, Christian Kirk, and Evan Ingram, one, they're all together and they were available for the majority of the year. Two, it was a very veteran-laden wide receiver core that knew exactly what to do. They could play in musical chairs because all of their talents allowed them to be interchangeable on the perimeter. And it was an offense with Doug Peterson that did a lot of horizontal routes, but because the guys were so good at being able to kind of jump in and fill multiple roles, it was really, really easy by design for Trevor Lawrence. It was easy for him. They made it work, and the offense just rolled. Last year, Calvin Ridley comes in, Marvin Jones goes out, and there's a lot of expectation for Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley was a guy who played at a Pro Bowl level. Calvin Ridley was expected to kind of step into the offense as the number one receiver and give them something that they hadn't had. And maybe it was unfair to kind of put that kind of pressure and expectation on Calvin Ridley because Calvin Ridley had been away from the game for 2 years. The rust showed on his game, and it felt like the Jaguars were really forcing the ball to Calvin Ridley as opposed to year one under Doug Peterson, where the ball just went to the open man. You just got back, whoever's open, they got it. It wasn't this forced nature like, hey, I got to force feed the ball to somebody. Whereas last year, it felt like the offense was a little more forced than it had been previously. I think that certainly impacted Trevor at the beginning of the year because you're trying to fit in a new player to an offense that really had been rolling within a system that was pretty interchangeable and dynamic in those things. And with Press Taylor taking over the play calling, I think he also was trying to find his cadence and rhythm directing an offense with a quarterback that was on the rise, but it's still different. I kind of liken it to if we're playing the video game, you and I can play with the same team, but we have different plays and our styles are different. I think Press Taylor's style is a little different than Doug Peterson. And so there's a bit of an adjustment that Trevor Lawrence had to make as he has a new voice in his ear and a new guy kind of scripting out how the game can play. Despite that, look, the numbers are still really, really solid when we look at it. The 65.6% completion rate. Look, man, that's upper echelon when we talk about the league. The 21 touchdowns and 14 interceptions, it's solid. It certainly could be better. The 14 interceptions, particularly the egregious interceptions that happen down in the red zone, they need to be improved and they need to be managed. But it's not one of those things that you absolutely crush the quarterback for. I think if you really dig deeper, the injuries that happened for Trevor Lawrence throughout the season, I think they certainly impacted his play. One, early, he has a knee injury against the Indianapolis Colts where, look, we're uncertain on whether he's going to play the next week against the New Orleans Saints on a Thursday night. Didn't really practice, shows up on Thursday, goes through it in warmups, and actually has an outstanding game against the Saints. Big game, primetime game. Everyone had an opportunity to see it, and you just kind of saw the light go on. To me, that kind of confirmed all the toughness and all the grittiness that you love about Trevor Lawrence. You now go later in the year, you begin to see a series of injuries that really impacted not only his performance on game day, but it impacted his ability to practice. And I think if we learned anything about Trevor is Trevor might not be one of those players who can go long stretches without practicing, but playing well on the field. And in a game that we view as a developmental game, practice reps matter. And the lack of practice reps for Trevor Lawrence down the stretch might have impacted the way that he played on those game days, the last, 4 or 5 games of the season. Even when you think about that, this team was in a position to win the division and go into the postseason if they take care of business. The final game of the season, they didn't do it. So now we're having this debate about whether Trevor Lawrence should get his money based on the team falling short, even though he contributed to that, but he certainly didn't stink up the joint when it comes to being a quarterback. So now let's talk about why Trevor Lawrence should get paid and the advantages of the Jaguars paying him now as opposed to taking a wait and see position. So Trevor Lawrence has had the 5th-year option picked up at $25.7 million. So that means in 2025, he'll play under that number, which is still a low cap number for the Jaguars. You still can build the team. Well, now you have an opportunity to sign him to an extension, which will tack years on to the end of that deal, but secures that he can be here for the next, 7 years? Because it'd be the 2 years this year, next year, plus the 5 or whatever years that you add at the end of the current deal. Well, if we think about the going rate for quarterbacks, I mean, we're talking about $50 million. Jared Goff signing his deal at $53 million. We've seen guys creeping up to the $50 million mark. Josh Allen, all these other guys. That's just kind of what it's going to be for a upper echelon quarterback, a quarterback that is in the top 10. I talked about it briefly at the end of the last podcast about Trevor Lawrence being a top 10 quarterback, but I don't think I was really clear when I really discussed it. I talked about the AFC and I talked about Pat Mahomes and Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson. Justin Herbert and CJ Stroud probably ranking over top him. So that put him at 6. Then we think about in the AFC, we have Brock Purdy, we have Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, and Matthew Stafford. Of those guys, I don't know if we can unanimously put those 4 guys. So to me, Trevor Lawrence kind of stacks somewhere in that conversation as a top 10, a borderline top 10 quarterback coming off of a bad year. I think if we go back and we talk about Trevor Lawrence the year before, we're talking about Trevor Lawrence being number 6, maybe number 7 in the league. And that's always going to vary based on, kind of like the last exposure that you have on a player. But anywhere from 6 to 10 or 11, that's where Trevor Lawrence slots. So as we think about the money and why it's really significant, I think Carl Banks and Bob Papa brought up a really good point when they discuss Trevor Lawrence and Daniel Jones in that debate.
I want to go back to like the comparisons, and it's probably awfully quiet on the Jacksonville front and this is a kid that I still think is going to be a hell of a football player in this league, but their quarterback, and you guys can go back and look at all the scouting reports and everybody that had a microphone that said Lawrence was going to be the second coming. He was the quarterback that was a can't miss. He could still be can't miss, but he just ain't hit yet, right? And his numbers are eerily similar to Daniel Jones. And if you listen to the people talk about him, he's got more talent than Jones, right? But same thing happens. He's got 2 different head coaches, 2 different systems, and he has not been able to flourish. So it's all relative, folks. And, people will cite numbers and stats, and those stats can say whatever you want them to say. But if you're doing comps of Trevor Lawrence, who was a can't miss, and the first guy in the last damn near century who was coming out of college and was going to be a surefire success, versus the guy that went to Duke, right? And there were people that said it was a mistake. Well, those 2 guys have similar stats, but they also have similar circumstances. They've had system disruption. Trevor Lawrence, if he were in a Doug Peterson system consistently, you probably would have seen his consistent evolution to the guy that is, and he's freaking mega talented. But he's middle of the road right now because he's getting used to a new system now too. And as you can see, playing quarterback in this league ain't easy. It's not easy. And you need consistency at the position, and you need talent around those players. But, when you don't have a consistent coaching staff, a consistent system, and you have upheaval, these are the inconsistencies that you can expect.
So Bob Pop and Carl Banks both made really good points. And I think Carl Banks talked about some of the things that are really essential to young quarterbacks playing well. So there's a thing that are amongst the league where we talk about the 3 Ps that are essential to a young quarterback playing really, really well. And those Ps are play caller, playmaker, and protectors. If you have really good play caller, really good playmakers around the quarterback, and really good protection for the quarterback, young quarterbacks can flourish and thrive. And when Banks talks about Daniel Jones, he talks about, their numbers are comparable in terms of like people talking about Daniel Jones and Trevor Lawrence and, them trying to figure it out. And, people are really down on Daniel Jones, but they seem undecided on Trevor Lawrence and those things. But the point is, anytime you have an upheaval in systems and you have inconsistencies in terms of the players around the quarterback, it impacts the way the quarterback plays. Now, we would all love to say, hey, Trevor Lawrence should be able to do what Pat Mahomes did. It doesn't matter who you have around him that can do it. But I would say this, Pat Mahomes may end up being one of one when we look back at his career in the next 15 to 20 years. He might just be a unicorn that is able to handle all of the different things around him. But the consistent thing that Pat Mahomes has had, Andy Reid has been his play caller his entire time. different offensive coordinators, but Andy Reid ultimately has built the offense. So the consistency in the play caller certainly matters. And maybe when we examine Trevor Lawrence, maybe that is a little bit of the thing that impacted his play last year. Just a subtle tweak between Doug Peterson, Press Taylor, maybe that impacted how he played. The subtle changes in terms of the playmakers around him, Calvin Ridley in, Marvin Jones out, maybe that also impacted the way that he performed. Finally, the protection around him. We all know last year the offensive line underperformed based on expectations. Some of that was due to Cam Robinson not being available, only playing in whatever 8 games. He missed 4 to suspension, missed another 4 or so to injury, just wasn't available to be the franchise left tackle that he was expected to be. You think about Brandon Sheriff not being able to play at a high level because age, injury, and those things. Luke Fortner not being able to hold up his end of the deal as a top pick. And so now we're having to have a conversation about, hey, do we need to replace and upgrade the pivot position? Bring in Mitch Morris to give you veteran leadership, a 10-year vet who can come in and kind of solidify it. Maybe all the pieces around Trevor impacted the way that he played. And so we can't fully evaluate him based on the constant shuffling and shifting of things around him. That brings you to, hey, when you're the general manager, you have to grade the talent based on the talent, not necessarily grade the environment around him. When we do the evaluation of Trevor Lawrence, what you have to do is you have to check off a few areas, right? Hey, is he talented enough to be an elite player in this league? Does he have the leadership abilities to be the franchise quarterback for the long haul? Does he have the toughness that you want from your QB1, meaning he's going to take the ball each and every week? This is the first time we ever seen Trevor Lawrence sit out this past year with an injury. He always shows up on Sunday. He's always available when the Jaguars kick it off. That's what you expect from your franchise quarterback. The injuries have popped up, but look, more times than not, Trevor Lawrence has been able to play through anything and everything. So you love that part about him. And then the final part of it is he clutch? Is he a guy that can come through in big games and big moments and those things? I would say, like in watching him over time, he certainly has been able to come through time and time again when it's been big. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about the franchise quarterback, particularly when we're talking about paying the quarterback, you must be able to close your eyes and envision the quarterback having confetti fall on his shoulders. Meaning, do you see Trevor Lawrence as a Super Bowl winning quarterback? If you close your eyes and you have to envision Trevor Lawrence playing in a shootout game against the elite quarterbacks in this league, and the Jaguars need to hand him the ball and say, Trevor, go win it. Can you see Trevor go toe-to-toe with the likes of Patrick Mahomes? Can he go toe-to-toe with Josh Allen? Can he go toe-to-toe with, I mean, look, even Brock Purdy or Dak Prescott, if we talk about the championship, Matthew Stafford. Can you see Trevor Lawrence winning a shootout against the premier quarterbacks in the league? If you can envision Trevor Lawrence doing that, then it's a no-brainer why you have to pay him. Because at the end of the day, in a quarterback-driven league, to have a chance to win it all, you have to have an A-level quarterback or a quarterback that possesses A-level talent. There's little doubt, little debate that Trevor Lawrence certainly possesses that talent. When you go back and you look at all of the pedigree, all of the things that he's done throughout his time, we talk about high school, college, and the early part of pros, Trevor Lawrence has always been a winner. He's always won at a high level. He's always been central and integral to his team's winning games. When you have a player like that, you don't let those players walk out of the door. So to me, it's a very, very easy decision for the Jaguars to want to continue the relationship with Trevor Lawrence. Not only is he, look, a great guy in the community, a great guy in the locker room, a guy who has A-level talent, he's a winning quarterback. And it's very, very hard to find a winning quarterback in this league. And when you find them, you have to be willing to overpay to keep them. So when you look at these contracts that are going off the board, Jared Goff at $53 million, one of the reasons why is because the Detroit Lions discovered that, hey, Jared Goff may not be the best quarterback in the league, but he certainly is a quarterback who has Pro Bowl potential, who can get us to the winner's circle, as evidenced by this team, that the Lions, getting on a deep postseason run. If the Lions do that for Jared Goff, the Jaguars certainly need to do that for Trevor Lawrence. The evidence says that Trevor Lawrence can get the Jaguars to the winning circle. He can get them over the top, but it's essential that he has the things around him that enable him to do so. Play caller, playmakers, protectors. The play caller is there in terms of Press Taylor's still there, but maybe Doug Peterson takes an even bigger role now that Trevor Lawrence is very, very comfortable with the surroundings and the people around him. The playmakers are there. Christian Kirk coming back, Evan Ingram coming back, because I think everyone in the building now knows that those are the number one options in the passing game. Gabe Davis and BTJ giving them the big play weapons on the outside to stretch the field so we can add the long ball back to the offense. And then we think about the protectors. Yes, there may be questions about the offensive line, but when healthy and available, Cam Robinson, Ezra Cleveland, Mitch Morse, Brendan Sheriff, and Anton Harrison are good enough to protect Trevor Lawrence and allow him to do his thing. So to me, it's pretty easy. I think the deal is going to get done. I would anticipate the deal being one that puts Trevor probably in that 50 to 52 million annual category. And if it does, we'll look back on it in a few years and say, man, that was a great bargain. The Jaguars have their QB1 for the next, 5 to 7 years. It sets the franchise up for success. You have to build around it a little differently. But if you have the quarterback in place, you have a chance. And as long as the Jaguars have Trevor Lawrence, they certainly have a chance of finally making a deep postseason run and being the Super Bowl team that we all want the Jaguars to be. So let me know how you feel about that. Make sure you leave some comments. Make sure you rate, review the podcast on the podcast platforms that you get it. Make sure you tune in to Believe Network on Fubo. You make sure that not only do you look at Believe in Jaguars, but you also listen to all the other great programming and podcasts that we have available. And until next week, I'm Bucky Brooks. This is Believe in Jaguars. I'll talk to you next time.